His Excellency Engineer James Kimonyo, Ambassador of Rwanda and the United States, Her Excellency the UN Assistant Secretary General Clotilde Baraga Gasarabwe, and I want to thank you for coming and for honoring me and inviting me. I want to thank the Rwandan community that is organizing this commemoration. And I want to single out, in particular, Yvette Nyombayire Rugasagohunga, and also Vice Chair Alice Mutoni, with whom I corresponded quite a bit about this visit. It is an honor. Living in Nebraska, it's very rare that I get to attend these commemorations. I see them from afar. So it's really an opportunity for me to be with my people during this time. The title of my presentation is a question, and that is, who speaks for the survivors of the genocide against Tutsi, Rwandan Tutsi in particular? When we address this question, of course, we have to look at what the different connotations this question brings. What is suggested in that question? Are we saying who actually speaks for the survivors? Or who speaks on behalf of survivors? Who speaks for the survivors but shouldn't? Who does not speak but should? Who does not speak but couldn't? There are many other questions that came up with that, including whose voice is not allowed to come out. For today's purpose, I will concentrate on the survivor's voice on the story of the 1994 genocide of Tutsi Israel, because we have some other dominant voices that perhaps should not be speaking, but unfortunately and sadly, they are there. And in my life as a person who is in academia, I have to deal with these voices all the time. And I also want to suggest, with regard to the theme of this year's commemoration on self-reliance, that ability to make the survivors' voices dominate the discourse on that story is a major part of the process towards self-reliance for survivors. And first of all, let me give a few examples of the dominant voices that we see here, especially, and here I'm speaking as somebody who lives in the US, who's lived here half of my life, 23 years, and who has lived this story through knowledge that is produced from this point of view. I am familiar with knowledge, like the ones Taylor was talking about, people who are survivors who are producing their own knowledge, but I'm talking about the dominant voices from this particular place, and it is dominant because this is a voice that has been here since the 19th century. And I call this, I guess, it's the voice that follows the tradition of the white man's burden. This is a reference to Rudyard Kipling's poem, a long poem, in which he's a British novelist and poet, in which he was trying to explain, justify the necessity for imperialism from the West to the rest of to the non-Western areas of the world. In current terms, I would put it this way, and this is something I'm trying to articulate, and if you do not get anything that I'm talking about today, here's a sentence that I want you to retain. The problems are over there. The solutions are from here. Again, remember, I'm in the US, I'm in the West. The problems are over there. The solutions are from here. In addition, the diagnosis of the problems are over here, in the US or in the West. So that is one thing that I want you to retain. And this is something that we found in that poem by Rudyard Kipling. This poem attempts to justify why the West must go salvage the lost souls of non-Europeans. The relationship between colonialism/imperialism is clear in this poem, as it is clear in the dominant voices that we hear about the story of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. This colonial ideology and its influence, influences greatly the response to the genocides of Tutsi. And this largely explains how the ability for the survivor to tell his or her story was lost from the get-go. From the moment we saw these images on television, we knew that it was very clear that the survivor would not be able to put the input in there. So as mentioned by Tabitha earlier, those of us who lived here, we saw them through television images. And unlike some other events, for instance, the Holocaust, in which the tales of the genocide was told from, was documented in written form, the very first knowledge production of the story of genocide is done through images, television, photography, and cinema. And those are very important because it's very difficult to forget those images that were repeated over and over and told through that whole narrative of the white man's burden. And these were produced by the few journalists who were there. And you could say that these journalist lenses, camera lenses, both physically and figuratively speaking, are still dominant sources of knowledge about the genocide. Take, for instance, one of the dominant images. There are several. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. It is the stream of Rwandan refugees fleeing into Rwanda while the killing of Tutsi is still going on. So what we see here are the people who are absolutely not victims of the genocide of Tutsi, and that's what we remember. That's what people went there to help them. That's what we remember. That's what people remember. And here's a contemporary example, years later. We see headlines in the US newspapers says something like this: a survivor of the Rwandan genocide graduates from a high school in the US. Then you find out that this student, this is 2000, was a student who went through Congo, who was part of that stream of refugees going into Congo, and who is hijacking the story of the genocide of Rwandan Tutsi. It's not the student's fault. I'm happy for the accomplishments of this young person. But it's not the knowledge about the genocide of 1994 that we want as Rwandans who lost people or who are survivors. That's not the knowledge we want to dominate. So another one, again, think about images. I'm going to say it. I'm sure some of you would not like that I say it again because I don't want it to dominate this again, but it does dominate, unfortunately. Hollywood creates the story of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi through Hotel Rwanda. And I'm pretty sure anybody here who's from Rwanda or who works on Rwanda, who's an ally of Rwanda, every time you say the word Rwanda, they tell you that they know Rwanda because they watched Hotel Rwanda. So that's another knowledge, knowledge that people have about this. And it's very difficult to cut through. As a person who takes students to Rwanda, every student who wishes to go to Rwanda, they come because they have watched Hotel Rwanda. So we have to find ways to deal with that knowledge and dismantle this dominant voice. And again, Hollywood presents it in a Rudyard Kipling's manner. They need a hero, and they need, I guess, to reproduce the same knowledge over and over since the 19th century. But guess who's missing? The true survival, the authentic survival of the genocide of Tutsi. I want to also say scholars have, those again who do scholarship that I think is the most correct. They talk about how, because of these images, survivors immediately were relegated to play the role, a secondary role, which is to try to explain, those images, not explain what happened to them, what they saw happen, but to explain, to justify, to tell, that's not my story, that's not my story. And this is what we're still doing as we fight denial of the genocide, denial and negationism. I also want to tell you that this white man's burden mentality that produces knowledge that makes the victim, the survivor, disappear. It does exist among many of my colleagues, unfortunately. The so-called expert of Rwanda, of Africa. This is something, when I was a graduate student in Iowa, I first encountered such experts there when the genocide happened, where they refused to believe that the genocide happened because they did know some of the government officials. There's no way those people could do that. So we begin with a denier here. So which means the scholarship that's going to be produced is going to be tainted by the closeness or coziness with people who produced the knowledge to justify the killings of the Tutsi. Some of them have changed their minds, but I still see it in the production of knowledge. And for instance, at a conference, an American scholar laments how the post-genocide Rwandan government has refused to implement his suggestions. You know, he worked hard on his research and he decided these are the solutions. Again, problems there, this is the diagnosis, here's the solution from here to there. But in the same breath, this same scholar admitted conducting a quantitative research, statistically based research in Uganda on what was important for people there. And he was disappointed and dismayed to find out that people cared more about economic issues than what he had hoped for. He had hoped for, they would say, human rights are the issue. Forgetting here that economic rights are human rights. Economic justice is human rights as well. So again, priorities here. You know, I don't understand why the Ugandans are not thinking that this is what they need to have instead of this. So solutions and problems are done from here. Now, and you know, economic rights is very important because I remember in one of books that has been produced by Rwandan survivors, that's Esther Mujawayo, Survivante, in which after detailing, you know, the story of the genocide, she also says survivors still need daily, still have daily needs, basic needs, like food, shelter, and of course, ability to live in dignity and respect. I could go on and on and on these examples, but if they stick and they're dominant, unfortunately, and we have to fight through this. Before I talk about what the survivors, you know, knowledge has been produced, I want to share something with you that a student of mine and I conducted an interview with General Dallaire, whom many of you would know. And he said, this is a quote, direct quote, he said, in 1994, Hutus killed Tutsis. The rest is crap. That's not my word, okay? In my academic thing, I just use the word noise, right? Those are his words. So the people that just said, the example I just cited you, they are people who are trying to sell a lot of noise instead of sticking to the fact of what happened in 1994. We have examples of many people who have, survivors who have told their stories, including your project, Taylor. But also let's not forget about organizations of, survivors organizations like Ibuka. They do a lot of work in order to keep memory alive, to strengthen. But many of them, especially like in Europe, Ibuka in Europe, they're still trying to justify that to fight negotiationism, that it really happened. They spend a lot of energy on that. And we have, in my own academic field, literature, we have few, not many, few who have produced knowledge about the genocide. I'm just going to cite one of them. Many of them, you know them, but the most interesting one currently that I'm working on is Scholastic Mukasonga, who has written several books, and she just won a prize, a major literary prize from France. In terms of self-reliance, getting a prize for that kind of knowledge production is very important, because it makes it easier to disseminate. Because you can produce knowledge. If you don't disseminate it, where does it go? Right? This is why those dominant voices remain there. And we also have what I call allies, or the people that, a term that I'm trying to use with people who are not Rwandans, who have no connections to survivors, but who call themselves Rwandans. We have some of them here today who can relate to that. So these are people who, after having learned, seen, watched this, have purposefully written about it on purpose. One example is the Senegalese writer Boubacar Boris Diop, who has said this, and I quote him, and he says, "I do not live in Rwanda. Rwanda lives in me." So those allies, they tend to produce knowledge that is very useful to keeping memory alive and for future generations, of course. Finally, I want to address a question that I think Taylor brought up too, which is the difficulty for survivors to tell their stories. There have been many, many studies about the impact of trauma to be able to articulate what one has lived. Esther Mujawaya talks about this, the experience of surviving genocide, as having this film in your head. Only people who have seen the film with you can see that film. So it's very difficult. Here we are also talking about the limits of language to be able to say it. And also the fact that scholars, I know trauma from the context of just reading literature about it and writing about violence in literature. And it's just this experience of ambivalence that also Taylor mentioned, and I'm sure a colleague in psychology will probably talk about that. So the experience of trauma is characterized by ambivalence. It shows a complex relations between knowing and not knowing. Because there's this conflict of knowing, do I want to know? Do I want to go back to the story? Do I want to not know? There is a tension between one wanting to remember and one wanting to forget what happened, and one wanting to not say anything and one wanting to witness. Because there is a price that one pays by going over that experience. However, as one other psychiatrist has said, Dory Lobb, there is, the survivors, despite this ambivalence, is always compelled to tell, to testify. And because also by telling, the survivor is fighting between death and life. If you don't say it, you may die. It kills you to not talk about it. I guess I get one more minute, and personal, I guess, testimony. Like many of you, I was here too. And I do remember the somberness in that building that you're talking about when I lived in Detroit, that we visited quite often. And as an academic, I'm expected to be very objective. It took me years to admit that I'm not objective openly in front of my colleagues. And so I consider myself what we call an academic activist. I wear that label with pride, and I produce knowledge objectively, of course, it's very well documented, in ways that I try to cut through the crap. Thank you.